Good afternoon. I want to thank Laurel for the interview that, as I understand, she just gave. And I want to thank you all for allowing me to be part of this event, virtually as it may be. I know that's been challenging for you all as participants and for the organizers of the event, and I'm greatly indebted to be able to be a part of it. Again, I am Dave Ceppos, and I will be your keynote speaker for today. I want to give in a quick apology in advance that I'm recording this from my home, so it is entirely possible that there will be dogs barking or cars going by or leaf blowers or things like that. So I hope not, but if so, I apologize in advance. What I'm going to do is I want to dive right in. So first thing I want to do is go ahead and move right onto our agenda. In a second, I'm going to give you a tiny little bit more background about me as it relates to then some of the content we're going to cover here. So just a bit addition to what Laurel had covered. Then I'm going to go over some terms and definitions, particularly with a focus on change and some policy issues. Then I'm going to relate that to an analysis of conditions that we find ourselves in these days. I'm going to translate that into a hypothesis that I'm immediately going to contradict on purpose. And then from there, I'm going to go ahead and provide proofs and proposals of collaboration, and that'll close us out and lead us to the Q&A section. So the first thing that I want to do is talk a bit about change. And as I talked about my background, I oftentimes, as a public policy mediator, refer to myself as one part lawyer, which I'm not, one part therapist, which I'm not, one part cruise director, which I'm not, and one part rodeo clown. And the verdict's still out sometimes on that part. The reason I raise that is that with this discussion of change, there's going to be some aspects of here and a little bit later throughout the presentation where I'm going to talk about items that kind of border on the therapy part, as I refer to. And the reason for that is I don't want anybody to be lying down on a couch telling me their life story or holding hands and singing Kumbaya. But we are dealing about and talking about humans and policy, and humans are squishy. And that's the point of all of this, is how do you get past that? And sometimes there really is just an element of therapeutic condition. So I'm going to talk about change, both at an emotional and interpersonal level first. And then I'm going to transition to change when we think in the context of social change and policy change. And then, like I said, then I'm going to move on to some examples of things. So when we think about change, we think about things that can be unsettling. That's an inherent part of change. Change, however emotionally it affects us or not, there is still always a little bit of some upset because it is unsettling. And with that upset and with that dynamic, inherently comes fear. Now, fear, again, can play a lot of different forms. When I think about fear, usually, I commonly, think in the context of how would I feel if something tragic happened to a member of my family, or if something really challenging or tragic happened externally to me, a car accident, something like that. And my guess is maybe many of you do too. And that's completely reasonable. Fear, however, also has a very related emotional reaction, which is anger. Now, there's a logic to that. Human-wise and emotionally wise, when we feel fear and it is unsettling, we oftentimes need that sense of a defensive posture, the sort of the wall around us to get ourselves psychologically prepared to protect ourselves. It's sort of the armadillo nature of things. Now, when the interior voice of anger and that defensiveness comes up, that's completely fine. That's a very, again, logical human response. It's an internal response. When it becomes an external response of expression, then it can become problematic. And we see that a lot these days in behavior, and the loss of civility, as we would call it, and things like that. So I do think that there's a legitimacy to this cycle. Now, as I said, I also want to talk about change in the social and policy context. Now, this is an immense simplification of the past many, many decades of history. But when we think about social change, up to the early 1960s, we had a sense of trust in our institutions. These were the institutions that won wars and built enormous public projects. These were the institutions that harnessed science to allow us to expand agriculture and energy and things like that. And then for reasons that could take weeks of discussion unto themselves, and I'm not going to go into the details, beginning in the early 60s and moving all the way through into the 80s at least, we saw a change and began to see a failing of institutions, or a perception of failed institutions, and a failing of our trust. Watergate, Vietnam. We saw increased awareness of environmental impacts, and we saw policies created to deal with those impacts, which included early inclusion of a different kind of social voice and an involvement. We saw external to that the rise of social voice by people who were perhaps left out of the American dream in prior decades and were asserting themselves. And we saw, moving particularly into the 1980s, a real increase in bipartisanship and the rancor associated with that. Moving into the 90s, we saw and have seen a huge growth of the internet and information availability. And in the 2000s, as we know, we've seen an explosive growth of social media. Now, all of these conditions and all of these changes have a real impact. And I want to talk about that a bit. Down at the bottom, you see that box that says ecology of change. A change occurs when the change agent offers an improvement over the status quo. Now, improvement is a relative term, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here. But the bottom line is that when change occurs and is offered to us as individuals in society, we ultimately go, well, I could take this or I could take that, and I'm going to go with this for a while. I think that this looks interesting. And that's how these things grow. Now, when we talk about the prior change cycle that I spoke of, and we look at this, how this has been manifesting itself is the following. As a public policy mediator, I deal regularly with stakeholders. And to be candid, it doesn't matter to me whether my stakeholders are getting their news from CNN or from Fox, from MSNBC or from Newsmax. Doesn't matter. What we do know, and taking aside some of the terminology like fake news and things like that that have been playing out lately, what we do know is that there has been an increased biased nature to the delivery of information. And humans by general nature will go, as I call it, to find the information that upholds the truths we already believe. Now, that's not uncommon. It may be lacking in critical analysis, but it's not uncommon. Now, the challenge with that is if you go to your respective source for news and information, that source is doing two things. It is upholding your belief systems and the things that you hold dear, but more often than not, it is also delivering the counter information. And that counter information is creating in you that sense of fear. They're telling us something that somebody else is doing that challenges our belief systems, and that creates fear. And as we showed in the earlier cycle, that starts to create anger. Now, add to that the social media. Now, again, doesn't matter whether you use no social media at all or whether you're using social media of Twitter, Facebook, Parler, Gab, whatever. And notwithstanding, again, some of the most recent conditions going on with Twitter and how certain persons have been limited from that, the reality is that what all of these social media vehicles allow us to do is something that has never really been allowed before. We've always had the ability of speech as humans. We've always had the ability of free speech as Americans. We never had, up until now, the ability in an unfettered, uncontrolled way to say anything we want to anybody we want, anywhere they are, regardless of whether we're actually right or not. Now, added to that is what I call the violent anonymity of social media. So again, whether it's the information you're getting from an internet news source or the information that you're getting from social media, the same dynamic occurs. We see something stated, it challenges our belief systems. We react with fear, whether we know it or not. That creates anger in us. Next thing you know, we're hitting all caps, we're typing something up, and we hit send, and off it goes. Now, I submit to you that while the emotions that people feel when they're doing something like that are quite real and legitimate, I challenge and submit that were that not to be the case, and were instead those conversations happening in a coffee shop or a conference room or a community hall of a church, the sentiments by the people would be the same, but the behavior would not mirror the behavior that we see on social media. In essence, what we're seeing is a lack of civility. a loss of civility. So with that, that is the accompanying factor of change that we're dealing with. So with all that in place, I offer to you a hypothesis. It's not a jolly one, but it is what I earnestly believe professionally. Divisiveness, rancor, the loss of civility at the national scale will not minimize and may get worse. I sincerely believe that, unfortunately. But here is the corollary to that, the contradiction. It doesn't matter. And I'm going to tell you why I believe it doesn't matter. And then we're going to transition to some things. In 2005, I was really honored, very honored, to be asked to be one of 21 mediators and facilitators to support what was called the White House Conference on Cooperative Conservation. Now, this was under the Bush administration. It was to be held in St. Louis, and it was a great honor. But to be candid, the Bush administration at that time had not necessarily been known for a strong policy push on conservation and environmentalism. And as a neutral, I had to make sure that I was protecting my role as that and not being enabled or enabling others. So I was really grappling with, do I go or not? Do I take part in this? I was talking to my dad. My dad was a farmer, and he wasn't a very poetic individual, and he wasn't a very spiritual individual, frankly. But I was talking to him and telling him my dilemma, and my dad said, you know what? You got to bear witness. You're going to have no authority or ability to pass judgment on anything that happens unless you go there and you participate. That was sage advice, and so I did. Now, here's the thing. When I got there, and for 3 days as roughly 1,200 delegates streamed in and out of this conference hall in St. Louis, the interesting thing that took place was the following. If I had walked up to any one of those delegates and pulled them aside and said, hey, I'm just curious, do you consider yourself a Republican or an independent or a moderate or a Democrat? They probably would have self-identified. If I had said, do you consider yourself a conservative or a liberal or a progressive or a moderate? They would have self-identified again. But that never happened. I never had to ask that question. And I never literally observed a single person aligning or self-identifying themselves in that ideological way, because what was happening in that space was people dealing with their local and presenting their local conditions. It had nothing to do at a greater scale with the national dialogue. It had to do with, I come from such and such a place, there's a wetland, there's farmers, there's water issues, we need to deal with that. I come from such and such a place and there's grasslands and there's ranchers and we need to deal with that. So my belief here relative to that, and even more so now, given how things are increasingly divided, is we need collaboration. And it doesn't matter, like I said, that about my hypothesis, because we need old school methods. And I mean, even beyond what's going on with COVID and our inability to gather. We need old school methods to gather together, to be together, to discuss things. We need to avoid mutually assured destruction. And when I say mutually assured destruction, that is that ability of stakeholders and politicians and others to literally do that to each other. And if you want a perfect example of both that and the next one about durable and sustainable solutions, I only need to draw attention to what occurred a little over a week ago. A new administration came in, and one of the first things they did the very first day was sign almost 20 new executive orders that largely rescinded a whole host of policies from the prior administration. Now, the interesting thing about that is you might be bothered or support that, but the prior administration did the exact same thing. And when the prior administration of that administration had come in, they too did that. And that's what administrations do. They set forth their new policy. Now, that's fine at a national dialogue scale. But at a local level, that's really untenable. At a local level, for you and your watersheds or you and your water districts, every 4 years, changing and switching things back up is no way to address the institutional investments that you need to make in the millions of dollars. So you need durable and sustainable solutions, and you need to collaborate and at a local scale and with local voices. So with that, I'm going to transition now into the collaboration component of this presentation. Now, I'm going to give a hypothetical. This didn't really happen, but I'm going to give you a hypothetical. Let's say I come home one day and I announce to my wife, honey, I've been thinking about it and I've decided I'm going to buy a red Corvette. Now, My wife's logical response could be, no, you're absolutely not going to buy a red Corvette. What she also could do instead of that, though, is to instead say, why? Why do you want to buy a red Corvette, Dave? And with that question of why, that inquiry, that would set in motion a couple things. Now, for example, I could then answer, well, I'm pushing 59 years old and I am feeling a midlife crisis and I just want to look better about myself. Or I could say, I need to get from point A to point B a lot faster and I just want a fast car. I could say, look, I want to give off an air of success to people, and a red Corvette would certainly do that. All of those are completely reasonable answers. All of them have completely different solutions, none of which are necessarily buying a red Corvette. So the question then becomes, what do we do when somebody makes a statement like that? Well, as you see here on the screen, we're talking about interests versus positions, and that is the hallmark and the basis of collaboration. Your position is something you've decided upon. Your interests are what caused you to do so, those motivating factors. And this is a quote from Getting to Yes, the book. And if you've never read that, I strongly, strongly encourage you to do that. So my wife takes the inquiry approach instead of just saying, oh, well, red Corvette, that's kind of silly. And so what she does is she tries to decide and then tries to employ assessing my behavior. Now there's observable behavior and there's interest-based behavior. They're not disjointed from each other, but there is a difference. Now, I call this the behavior iceberg. The thing is not the thing. Let's say you come into work one day and there's Bill, and it's a Monday and you say, hey, Bill, and Bill gives you a look like you just killed his dog. Well, Bill just might be like that as a person all the time. You never know. But Bill might have the prior Friday found out that his wife had cancer. Or he might have found out that something was really wrong with his kid's school. You never know. The point being that it's always a factor of what is it we know versus what's happening and what role we are playing in a collaborative process to get past the what is it we observe to what is it that's actually happening. This is the hallmark and the starting place of collaborative dialogue, whether you're doing it in a structured manner, bringing somebody like me in, or just doing it on your own. So interest-based behavior, as I said, these motivators. Now, when we talk about interest-based behavior, as it says here, these are the most powerful things, the basic human needs that motivate us. Now, if this looks familiar to many of you, it's because it's basically tied to this, which if you took Sociology 101 in college or high school, you probably saw something like this. Now, professionally, I can tell you that I'm not so sure I agree with Maslow's assertion that self-actualization was the pinnacle of this. I don't really see people necessarily always behaving that way, but that's just my observation. But the bottom line is what Maslow was saying was there are these layers of things that aren't always there on the surface, but are very much there underneath. Again, the iceberg principle. So when we talk about interests, define the problem, interests are what we need, and positions are what we want. I want a red Corvette. I want my water diversion in a certain location. I want to protect this species in a certain way. Well, maybe that's the way to do it, and maybe there are other ways. So when we talk about collaboration, and again, at this local level, and creating a space of civility, what we're really talking about is at a starting place of interest-based inquiry. When that situation happens, so you're in a conference room regarding a watershed discussion that you and a bunch of other stakeholders are having, and somebody is talking, do you judge or do you seek to understand? Do you make assumptions, i.e. the iceberg principle, or do you take steps to confirm? Do you defend your own position? Because that's what's most important, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. Or do you seek to validate what these other folks are thinking? Do you treat this as a binary yes or no? Or do you go to the, what do you need? Now, here's the reality of human nature, one of many. As a person, as a human, I understand and interpret my own behavior incredibly generously, my actions. I do not necessarily understand and do not necessarily interpret generously somebody else's. Because again, I don't know their voice, I don't know their story. I know what I'm hearing in my head. So I have a favorite saying. I use this with virtually every group I work with, my staff, even my family. Nobody cares about your story until they see their story in your story. Now, really, that's a long-winded way, really, of sort of talking through the walk a mile in other people's shoes kind of thing. But it's a bottom line, fundamental basis of you've got to always be thinking about how is it that people are going to see themselves in your story. Okay, it's just a fundamental basis. So when we talk about interest-based communication, again, the hallmark of collaborative behavior and a collaborative process, what that translates to is what are the things that we can train ourselves to do and train others to do to help facilitate a more constructive dialogue? Well, this is where we're going to get back to some of that therapy stuff again. So, active listening. What's going on? A person's talking to you, ask, what's going on? They tell you. The immediate human response is you're really just pausing, waiting for them to say what's on their mind so that you can then go tell your story. Fight that urge. You'll get your chance, but fight that urge. Instead, find out what's going on and listen. Then before you dive into your story, do the validation. So what I hear you saying is, now you have worked with facilitators, many of you all the time, and you've seen facilitators do this, and it probably seems really cliche, and sometimes it is. But there's a reason why we do this. It's the validation step. What I hear you saying is this and this and this and this. Am I right? No, you didn't quite get that last part. Okay, please tell me again. Or am I right? Yeah, you got it. Great. And when you say, did I get it right? And they say, yeah, they feel better. And when you have it happen to you, you feel better because you're like, somebody got me. They understood me. So you confirm, did I get that right? And then if you choose to go the empathy route, all right, I get it. I understand that. That must be really hard. I could certainly, I feel kind of similarly. All this comes down to yet another saying I have, which is there's a difference between being right and doing the right thing. Humans love to be right. We want to be right all the time. That brings us back to the social media. Somebody says something on Facebook or whatever, and I disagree with it. Oh yeah, boom, 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 hit send, blam. I just made myself right. Fight that urge also, because there's a difference between being right and doing the right thing. And I would submit to you that being right is making sure what you're most doing is saying, asserting yourself and your beliefs. And doing the right thing is taking these steps that you see in front of you. So the way that that plays out, whether it's in your interpersonal relationships or professional relationships, are what's called the retaliatory cycle or the conciliatory cycle. So you're in a conversation with somebody and they're saying something, maybe they're saying something that accidentally or on purpose triggers you, but it does. The being right part is, oh yeah, you triggered me, I'm going to counter that with something back. It's completely logical and appropriate human response that goes all the way back to the change, fear, anger cycle that I referred to earlier. Fight that urge. The retaliatory cycle is a almost God-given way to ensure that you're going to go from DEFCON 4 to DEFCON 1 in a conversation, whether it is with your significant other or in a professional context. Somebody says something, you react, you go through the cycle, you elevate some more, you elevate some more, boom. You're in an explosive situation now. Whereas if you can train yourself, again, in a structured way with thoughtfulness and a collaborative dialogue to go the conciliatory cycle, somebody says something, maybe it's even something that affects you. Maybe it's something that feels uncomfortable to you. If you instead go back to this, force yourself to not go to the emotional anger, fear response, and instead go to the, okay, tell me why you're feeling that way. Let's analyze that a little bit. And you take that route. And then you go through to the, ultimately the, I get it. I hear what you're saying. I don't like being characterized that way, but I understand what you're saying, and let's talk about that. In almost all circumstances, unless you're dealing, and these people exist, unless you're dealing with people who really don't have an ability to gauge and read social cues. And there are people in our lives that are like that through no fault of their own. But unless you're dealing with somebody like that, if you have the capacity in a collaborative conversation to go the conciliatory route, almost always that person will rise to wherever you set it. So they say something, it triggers you, you pause, you allow the trigger to pass, you allow yourself to go into the interest-based conversation, you set a different tone, Yeah, I understand. Geez, I really hope we can work it out. I've always really respected you. That person almost always is not going to still go to yet another attack. They are going to meet you and try to match you because that's how humans behave when given the opportunity to do that. So these are very, very important steps and very important activities. So conciliatory gestures, again, used not just in day-to-day, but also in these collaborative dialogues that I'm talking about. Apologizing. I'm really sorry that you feel that way. I'm sorry that you've experienced that way. I don't mean that, and I certainly didn't want you to think that, but so on and so forth. Owning responsibility. Okay, I can say I contributed to that. On and on. I'm not going to go through all these, but the point being, learning how to perfect conciliatory gestures in these local conversations with the people you need to work with is the highest and best way to create a civil environment, and something else that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. So when we go through all these efforts, and despite all the rancor, despite my gloom and doom hypotheses, when we think about the localized conversation, this is the approach. We're not dogmatic at my organization at CCP, but generally speaking, these are the stages we do in order to create a structured, managed, facilitated, mediated, collaborative process. We assess the issues and concerns. Usually that means we go out and we have conversations with all the key players that are going to be a part of this. We interview them. What we're looking for is themes and trends. Where are the places where people align? Sometimes they don't even know that they're aligning. Sometimes they've been talking past each other using different terms. But if we can bring them together and talk individually and confidentially, we start parsing out that there's a lot more alignment than they think. And then sometimes there are conditions that they're not, but even that's important. Because better to go diving in and say, look, I can hold up a mirror to you all now. I talk to all of you. And I know for a fact that you actually agree on this and this and this and this. And here's the stuff you don't agree on. So this is where the deep dive and the effort's got to go. This is where we spend the money and the time. Then you go through some organization. And again, in a formal collaborative process, you need to give this process some structure, some rules of engagement, as I call it, whether it's a chartering or a guiding principles or whatever the case may be. But you want to have some rules of engagement so things aren't chaotic. And people know that if the wheels come off the wagon at times, and they probably will in a tight conversation, a tough conversation, you guys can go to your charter, you can go to whatever you developed and say, wait, we thought this, we considered this, we anticipated this, and we know what we're going to do now. We know how we're going to do decisions. We know how we're going to communicate things. Then comes what I think is the most important part of a collaborative effort, which is to educate. You learn about everybody. Everybody gets their chance to speak about themselves and their worldview. And here's the beauty of this. When this happens, this isn't just happening about, well, I'm a water manager and then you go through a litany of all the different water things. Part of the education is just learning who you are as people. And I guarantee you that it is incredibly harder for people to demonize each other when they realize that, oh, you know, he's got 2 kids like I do, and he's been a little league coach or she's been a little league coach just like I have. You sometimes literally break bread or drink beer or whatever with each other. And in doing so, you don't have to agree. You probably won't agree, but you're starting to see each other as people. And then you're also starting to learn where they come from. Then you move into negotiation. Now, the interesting thing about negotiation is that under a collaborative process, you're looking to negotiate, never to deviate from your interests. Your job and commitment is to stay wedded to your interests. However, your commitment is also in a collaborative model to be neutral or better to all the other people at the table. Well, if you think about that, if you haven't spent some time educating and learning what the other folks are thinking and where they're coming from, how can you possibly negotiate essentially on their behalf to make sure that they aren't getting nailed on something? Well, you can't. So you got to go through the education stage first, and then you go into negotiation. Again, structured conversations, never deviating from seeking to achieve what you want, but not doing so in a way that's going to negatively impact somebody else. That's the promise. That's the commitment. When you do that, however cliche this sounds, and I admit it does, however cliche this sounds, when you do that, you make the pie bigger. You go into a conversation at the start and you think, we've been in these conversations before. I know what they're thinking. They know what I'm thinking. The pie's this big. We're just going to divide it up as if I'm buying a car from the guy down the street. When you get into this kind of a discussion, you piece things apart. You force yourself into different ways of conversing. You open up and expand the possibilities to things you didn't even think about. Again, are they just thinking of buying a red Corvette with no rhyme or reason or logic? Or can we talk about some other ways other than the red Corvette? Can we talk about some other ways other than where the water diversion goes here, or the fish about this or that? And if you do that, then you've resulted in some durable and sustainable outcomes. And that's where you want to get. And that's the local voice, and that's the local conversation. So in conclusion, we need old school methods. We need to gather. We need to discuss, despite everything else that's going on out there and around us. We need to avoid mutually assured destruction. We need and can create durable and sustainable solutions, and we need to collaborate. Thank you very much.